Announcing the 1916 Company app, fully redesigned, available on the Apple App Store and Google Play, combining new watches from many brands with more being added all the time, and our traditionally vast collection of pre-owned luxury timepieces. A redesigned homepage, a natural departure point for trading, browsing our inventory, and checking out our studio originals. Build your online wish list, a virtual collection that allows you to leverage all of the makes, models, and reference numbers in our databases. And seamless trading. Contact your advisor, forward pictures, get an estimate, and choose your next match from our vast online inventory. All of this on the 1916 Company app, available on Google Play and the Apple App Store. Hi, I'm Tim Mosso of the 1916 Company, here with our own Jack Forster, and we are reviewing the year. It's the year in review. Jack, this was an odd year because there wasn't one overarching narrative or milestone event that we'll remember 5, 6, 7 years down the road. Let's just do this, I guess, more or less scattershot, starting in February.
Sure.
Both of us were in Paris for the Louis Vuitton Watch Prize for Independent Creatives. What was your impression of this? This was the inaugural run. How did it do?
It was fantastic to be there. It was very interesting to be part of the selection committee, part of the voting committee, and the winning watch was also a very interesting one technically. First of all, I think it's a very valuable thing to do, and I think it's a very interesting thing to do. And there's obviously, it creates opportunities for Louis Vuitton and for LVMH to work directly with up-and-coming independent watchmakers as well. So that adds some value to the sort of value proposition from what they're doing from a design and from a technical standpoint. It's going to be really interesting to see how the next several editions of this play out. I really hope that it's something that Louis Vuitton sticks with, because I think it's a fantastic way of shining a light on independent watchmaking and supporting its diversity. And we've seen, you and I have both seen, really interesting initiatives kind of come and go. I mean, the one that I think of the most is the Concours de Chronométrie, which lasted 2 years.
Well, a little bit more than that, but it was pretty much dead once it became too prominent, because no one wants to lose.
Right, exactly. And it's easier with something like the LVMH Prize for Independent Watchmaking, to sort of say to yourself, well, it's just, it's an honor to participate. And there are so many, there were, I don't know if there will be this year, but there were so many nominees that pretty much anybody who made it to the finals, could actually genuinely feel like it was a privilege and like it was an honor to be there.
Now, I thought it was really cool because, look, I love the GPHG, but at the end of the day, the GPHG is all pomp and circumstance, and it's a little bit self-aware, kind of like the Oscars. It really does match that sort of Oscars of watchmaking type of, I guess, shorthand, you could say. What I thought was interesting is that with the Louis Vuitton Prize, it's one of a couple of different initiatives by Jean Arnault to sort of make his mark in the watch space. So one was the launch of the Tambour last year, which was sort of like a mainstream piece for the meat of the market, the sports watch buyer. And then, of course, the relaunch of Gerald Genta and Daniel Roth, which is going to sort of create a more visible name in front of the long respected but sort of background La Fabrique du Temple Louis Vuitton. Great factory, but that's not something you can put on a dial. So I think he's brought back these heritage brands to try to show that this is a credible operation that has a real reverence for history and for traditional crafts. And then finally, by becoming a patron of the arts with the Watch Prize, he sort of becomes, not necessarily the overdog behind a giant watch company or a giant luxury firm, but now the man who pulls for the underdog. So I think this is like the third tip of the trident he's wielding right now. And I also thought that was fun because it was relatively low key and the right guy won. Like, Andreas Streller was there, and while I love Andreas Streller, if he had won, it would have been like giving a Best New Artist award to Bruce Springsteen.
Yeah, it would have been weird.
So Raoul Page's guy working out of his house, making his 6 to 10 watches a year, lovely régulateur détente escapement in a wristwatch. We've long been told that can't happen. He made it work. And I feel like the right guy won, and seeing his tears up on the stage, that was genuine. That was not scripted.
Yeah, I mean, that was, the emotion felt very genuine. And you were speaking of La Fabrique du Temps. I mean, it's an amazing place to visit. You and I have both been there more than once. And it feels now, and it has increasingly felt to me, less like a watch factory and more like a sort of creative studio. You know, I mean, it's a now. I mean, components come there from different places in the in the watch industry, but nonetheless, there's still a lot of stuff going on at La Fabrique Duton under that roof that feels small scale, artisanal, and genuinely touched by the specific tastes of the people who are working on the watches and who are creating them, which is unusual.
Yeah, and with the number of one-offs and custom pieces they make, it's hard to build a brand around under-the-table custom orders from elite clients. So bringing back Genta and Daniel Roth really allows them to have sort of a face to what's otherwise a really inspired factory, but it's difficult to market a factory without an identity or a brand. So I think that's sort of where they are now.
Yeah, so if there's, I mean, I don't think that there is a singular narrative arc for 2024, as you said, but I think one of the interesting narrative arcs has been what Louis Vuitton watches, specifically, not LVMH in general so much, but Louis Vuitton watches is doing with developing products, with encouraging independent creatives. It feels like a very, very interesting way to go.
Like the LV Regepi collaboration?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we might get back to this because there's some personnel changes going on in the world, and we'll touch on LV. But that was just in February. We went to the Watch Prize for Independent Creatives. So I thought I would start it there because in the watch industry, there's not a whole lot going on in February. Moving on from that, what caught your eye?
The big stuff that I remember, the two big things that I remember are they're both complicated watches, and they're about as far from practical and as far from relevant to the average or even the non-average relatively wealthy watch collector as you could possibly imagine. But I mean, one of them was the Berkley, the Vacheron Berkley Grand Complication. First watch to actually have a real Chinese perpetual calendar in it, which is, it's essentially a mathematically unsolvable problem, but they figured out how to get it into
Eventually you run out of road. The idea is to push it out as far as you can.
Exactly. And the other watch that I thought was interesting was the IWC Portugeiser Eternal Calendar with the 45 million year moon phase. Yeah.
Well, why don't we talk about that? Because that came out during Watches and Wonders, and I think there's a lot we could say about Watches and Wonders, which is in the old time slot that used to be Basel World, but in the venue that used to be SIHH.
Right.
So that is really the trade show now. There's going to be 60 brands this coming year. This year, it seems like all of the major brands, save the Swatch Group, were there exhibiting. Yeah. It's still a wonderful place to go to launch independent brand watches, but you're also going to see Richemont, you're going to see Patek Philippe, Rolex, LV, Tudor. It's a big happening.
Chanel.
Exactly, which now has its fingers in all sorts of pots in the independent space.
Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about Watches and Wonders. What caught your eye there? The Eternal Calendar, of course.
I think those two pieces primarily are what I remember. There were, which is not to say that there weren't a bunch of other wonderful watches, but those are the two that really kind of stand out for me, which is weird a little bit because one of them is a one-off made for an uber wealthy collector who is willing to wait 10 to 12 years.
It's not a this year thing. It just came out this
year. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And the other, the Eternal Calendar is, it's a tour de force of computational watchmaking. I don't think that you could have produced a 45 million year accurate moon phase watch without prototyping it in software. And in fact, they were completely open about the fact that they prototyped it in software. But I struggle to think of a more mainstream release. Other than the watch that Cartier released that actually runs backwards.
Oh yes, of course. That's a fun piece, and it's interesting because Cartier in the last couple of years has really been strong, even as they've moved away from really high watchmaking, which I find fascinating because they went all in on high watchmaking for the better part of 2 decades, from I guess I'd say maybe the millennium right up through about 2016, 17. And watches that are relatively simple now have them on a winning streak.
Yeah, it's true. The what they used to call the fine watchmaking collection. As a technical watch writer, it was really, really fun stuff to write about. I love Carol Forestier's work. She goes all the way back to the original design that gave birth to the Ulysse Nardin Freak. And she was their chief movement designer, chief constructor at Cartier while they were making all of this, crazy stuff, mystery tourbillon watches and mystery this, mystery that, and very unusual perpetual calendars. And I think that those remain fascinating watches. However, they're hard to understand. They're very expensive. They're atypical for Cartier if you take a longer look back at the company's entire production. And honestly, I think Cyril Vigneron really understood what people actually wanted from Cartier when he dialed that stuff back a little bit and started to foreground reissues and reinterpretations of some of their classic designs. I think one of the big success stories for Cartier in 2024, and really for the last few years, has been the Privé collection.
Yeah, I would also say various versions of the Santos since 2018.
Yeah.
But we're talking about this year. So in terms of watches and wonders, a couple things come to mind for me. Obviously, the Eternal Calendar, we'll touch on that a bit more when we get to GPHG. But I really loved the Chapek Promenade Goutte d'Eau, which was a lovely little 100-piece, 38mm stainless steel enamel dial watch with a lovely ripple. It's almost like you've got the ripple across imaginary water, several shades, the illusion of depth. It's really nice. For something static, it looks incredibly dynamic. And the symmetry helps too, because it's off center. Turn it all over, and we get the movement we really wanted in a Chapek dress watch. We get the SXH5 from the Antarctique. So now we've got that movement by Daniel Martinez and Emmanuel Boucher. Real pedigree there, micro rotor, 60-hour reserve, nice and thin, beautifully decorated, especially that central steel bridge that it's got. Now this is a 100-piece edition, which seems like it's a lot for a limited edition from a small independent.
I wonder though, and it's interesting that it was a 100-piece limited edition, because the way that you're describing it, if you hadn't seen the watch, you would think to yourself, well, that sounds like a home run watch to have permanently in the catalog.
Yes.
And maybe you do it in limited numbers. Okay, maybe instead of doing it in a 100-piece limited edition, you do 50 of them per year.
And it might be that way, where 100 is going to be the total build-out, but it's not strictly limited to this model year.
Yeah.
I thought that was the best new watch at Watches and Wonders, even considering the absolute avalanche of new stuff that comes out. Otherwise, at Watches and Wonders, I thought the change at the top at Grubel Forsey with Antonio Calce sort of stepping aside for Michel Neidiger, I was a little bit surprised to see that, but at the same time, I think the message was clear. I think maybe they're going to kind of take a step back from the indulgence in sports watches, and you're going to see a little bit more of what Grubel Forsey was known for previously.
Actually, one of the big stories for me, and this is getting a little bit further along in the year from the actual trade show, was the Nano.
Ah, yes, the Foudroyant.
Yeah, the Nano Foudroyant, which was a fascinating watch, and it was technically very much what you would expect from Grubel Forsey. It was not aesthetically what you would expect from Grubel Forsey, which I thought was super, super interesting.
Now, I thought that was one of the coolest watches of the year, and also the kind of watch we haven't seen much of from them the last few years. Antonio was CEO for 4 years, and he did incredible things to increase distribution and break into the sports watch market. But I think for a lot of people, Grubel Forsey was always a ridiculous, over-the-top watch, polished to the nth degree, and the company lost a little bit of that luster during the time, and I think this is really kind of like a course correction to go back in that direction. And I think other than the fact that this watch you've just mentioned is around 38mm in diameter, it does feel like something that would be vintage Grubel Forsey.
It does. It does.
Absolutely unnecessary, over the top, super technical, and wonderful for all of those qualities.
Like if Grubel Forsey had been around in the 1950s and they'd had access to the technology necessary to make a Nano Foudroyant, it looks like the kind of watch they would have made in like 1955.
Yeah, exactly. I would agree with that. And I'd say that's a really interesting take from them. But the sort of no compromise overarching philosophy is what feels like vintage Grubel Forsey to me.
Yeah.
So I'll be excited to see where that brand goes in the future now that they're sort of refocusing on what got them to the dance, so to speak. I would also say it was a little bit interesting to see that there wasn't really a dominant product trend this year, in my opinion. I would maybe say that this was the year of the inexpensive exclusive watch. So hear me out here. Tudor Black Bay Chrono Pink.
Yeah.
About $5,650. Even major retailers of Tudor were getting like 2 or 3 of them.
Right.
Not expensive, but you've got a better chance of getting some sort of enamel dial Patek Philippe on request and application than you have of maybe getting that Tudor. Also, Studio Underdog, the Studio Underdog Smoked Salmon. Now you've got a watch that was a lovely little chronograph, a watch only $2,000 and only for sale for about 9 hours. And so we have this salmon-dialed chronograph, now with a Swiss movement, because previously it was a Chinese Venus copy. $2,000, but if you weren't inside that 9-hour sales window, you weren't getting it.
Yeah.
Max Busser, still going with the Mad 1 series, but now evolving it, the Mad 1S. Now here too, we have a Swiss movement now for the first time. Previously it was a Miyota, now it's Le Jouperet. And not an expensive watch, once again, but only 1,500 pieces. And I want to say it was like 2,900 Swiss francs, but 1,500 pieces, and not nearly enough to satisfy demand. And also Atelier Wen with the Perception, the Mu. Lovely product of a couple of Europeans working out of China. But this is a watch that was only available for a couple of weeks before they closed the order book. But still, $3,600, not expensive. So this was end to end the year of the exclusive but inexpensive watch.
And that's a very interesting strategy to pursue because, you know, I think for it to work, you have to give people a sense that there's more than one opportunity to connect with your brand and own the watch. Then, like, you can't do it like 2 times a year because all you'll do is you'll create a huge amount of anticipation. A lot of people will be focused on trying to get the watch, assuming it's a good design and you know your company is resonating with people. But then, you know, 2 times a year, you're going to satisfy 1,500 people and create frustration for thousands. And at some point, people start to disconnect from your brand unless you can figure out where the sweet spot is in terms of offering X number of limited editions over, you know, Y period of time, and end up hopefully with enough watches on enough wrists, enough different watches on enough wrists, that people are seeing them, people are able to talk about them, but nobody's seeing too many of the same watch on other people's wrists.
Yeah, I think with these micro editions, it's really cool to get buzz around your brand without overcommitting and overproducing. So if you're something like Studio Underdog, you build your brand around accessible pricing, fun design, a great community, superb word of mouth, but you don't make too many watches.
Yeah.
And if you're MB&F, you're trying to find ways to keep people engaged because not everyone can buy a 5 or 6 figure watch every year or several times a year. So how do you keep people connected in between those huge financial decisions?
Right.
You give them something that's just as exclusive maybe, but also priced at the level of a fashion accessory.
Yeah, and I think that one of the great things about the way MB&F have handled the Mad 1 is, while it's very smart strategically, it doesn't feel like a strategic move. It just feels like a fun watch.
Now, I think this is a good kind of segue to some of the news that came out in the late summer. I would say early summer this year was a fallow time. There was very little news. Unless you went to Madison Watch Week, late spring, early summer, it was a quiet time. But by the time we get to August, we're starting to look at Geneva Watch Days. I thought that by far the most interesting late summer news development was Max Busser selling 25% of his company to Chanel. We mentioned Chanel earlier.
Yeah.
They have a stake in Romain Gaultier, they have a stake in F. Pijorn, they have a stake in MB&F, and that's alongside having their own high horology watch brand and owning Bell & Ross and a number of component suppliers like Chatelain. So where does Chanel come from in this deal? What are they looking for, and what was Max looking for?
That is a very interesting question. Anything I could say on the subject would be speculation. I mean, I think that what Max is looking for, obviously, is a financially stable partner that understands what he is doing, wants to support the vision that he has for the brand, and has deep enough pockets and a persistent enough presence in the luxury world to be a silent partner that lets him, at least an initially silent partner, that lets him start to build a real legacy for the brand. And I mean, by legacy, I mean a sustainable entity with enough of an internal culture of design and an internal culture of a particular kind of vision that it can go on after he retires.
Yeah, I think it's kind of an Apple after Steve Jobs type thing. Have you institutionalized enough of your philosophy that innovative and worthwhile products can continue to issue forth after the last pipeline products from your time at the helm have come to market?
Yep.
I would also say that realistically, because Max once told me that the toughest and most stressful time he's owned MB&F was a period when he was trying to develop 4 movements in-house at the same time. And he said that was the closest he ever came to a worst case scenario, a wipeout, just because of the cost, expense, and the manpower. When you've got Chanel, they have so many component suppliers that the cost of getting a lot of the parts of the watch can be far closer to like a wholesale cost.
Right.
You know,
right.
obviously Chanel gets a lot of engineering help from Romain Gaultier on its high horology Chanel watches. Gaultier does some engineering, does some component manufacturing. When you've got case and bracelet makers like Chatelain in-house, you've got some leverages that allow you to find some cost savings in components.
Yep.
Without actually cheapening anything. It's now coming from inside the house.
Well, and I think you've hit on something that is really, really crucial and not necessarily always well understood by the enthusiast community, which is especially for small independent brands like MB&F, and Resonance is another example, which are technically unusual, technically distinctive. I mean, these are not the guys that historically component suppliers have been in a rush to talk to, first. If you are a component supplier, you don't like go into the office on a Monday morning, sit down, drink your first espresso of the day, and pick up Benoit, from Resonance on speed dial because he's your biggest customer. These guys are lucky usually to get the attention of suppliers at all. So for them, and Max went through this, certainly, for them, I mean, every MB&F watch, every horological machine basically has a new movement. I mean, the base caliber a lot of the time is the same, but a lot of the other elements of the movement are distinctive, and getting deliveries on time from suppliers in general is a challenge, even if you're a fairly big, powerful brand. And for these smaller guys, it can literally be a matter of life and death for the brand to be able to coax their suppliers into working with them somewhat reliably, every year. So I think you're absolutely right about Chanel offering that.
Industrial and component alliances.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think also...
And just clout with suppliers to make sure the orders come in on time.
Yeah, that's true. Also, if Chanel can pick up the phone and remind the supplier, that might have actually more influence on the supplier than Max saying for the 10th time, hey, a little watch company wants its parts. Yeah. It's like, hello, this is Chanel. Why didn't you answer my call?
Right.
Oh, no, you will next time, I promise. Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. I'm glad we resolved that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Click.
This is Chanel. Perhaps you've heard of us.
Yeah, exactly. So no, don't call me, I'll call you. Click, just like that. So that's a great alliance to have for him. And 25% is not 100. So
what did you think of the, speaking of Geneva Watch Days, horological alliance between Ming, Fleming, and Shapiro. Ming, Fleming, and Shapiro.
I think it's
and the
interesting.
first thing that came out of the alliance was a fairly difficult thing to produce, which was a tantalum bracelet compatible with all of their watches.
Shapiro was already doing tantalum cases, and it's the bracelet element here that has me intrigued, because I've been told by people in the industry now that although you will still wear out tools, tantalum is no longer as difficult to work as it was a few years back, and I mean even like 5, 6, 7 years back. So the fact that smaller companies like, Shapiro and Sartori Biard, among others, have access to tantalum cases tells me this is no longer AP in the 80s or FP Journe in the 2000s.
No,
working with a material that was so prohibitively difficult that even platinum was preferable.
But it's interesting. I mean, the tantalum hasn't changed, the material hasn't changed. So what has changed? And I mean, Shapiro's making these bracelets, I think, in his workshop in Los Angeles.
I think the manufacturing methods have changed. I think there's just more experience working with it. And once upon a time, back in the 1930s, it would have been a hell of a lot easier to make something out of gold or silver than to make it out of stainless steel. I think just periodically in the industry, there are materials that have not previously been used that come into favor, and the industry just has to learn how to work with them. Like famously, I think the prototypes of the Royal Oak back in 1972 were white gold, because milling them out of stainless steel was not a core competence of the manufacturer at the time.
Right.
So I think it's just a matter of the computers getting better, the equipment getting better, the people who make them are more familiar with it. And it may even be that the tooling itself is cheaper to make, so if you wear out a set of drill bits, whatever. Interesting, we'll see where it leads, but I do think tantalum bracelets are the future, and we're going to see more of them. And certainly if an alliance of that size can do it, I think there's no reason why, for example, we couldn't have another Royal Oak in tantalum down the line. Let's talk about late summer and the fall now, because this is when we start to heat up again. All of a sudden, we've got a lot of events, we've got a lot of watch debuts. We have the GPHG. Why don't we talk a little bit about the GPHG and how we feel it shook out? We already know how you feel about the Eternal Calendar.
Yeah.
Would you have picked, you liked it at Watches and Wonders, would you have picked it as Aiguille d'Or?
Possibly, because I'm a sucker for that sort of thing. I mean, all you have to do is say to me, hey, Jack, we've got this watch. It's got a moon phase that's accurate to 1 day in 45 million years. And I'm like, 45 million years? That's a lot of years.
But isn't the best thing about it the way it looks? I mean, let's be honest. It's got a glass box crystal. Those are very trendy now. It's got a dial that's a combination of lacquer and sapphire, which looks awesome. Yes, 45 million year moon, 400-year calendar, both new features. But fundamentally, I think if it weren't for the dial, I don't know if it would be a showstopper.
Well, and this is the thing. I mean, it's actually very difficult to make a successful, high-grade, complicated watch. And I mean, we've seen over the decades any number of watches that are technically distinguished and beautifully finished, but which just fail the aesthetic test. I mean, they're kind of ugly. And being a brilliant watchmaker does not necessarily make you a good watch designer. And being a good watch designer does not necessarily give you an understanding of fine watchmaking on the level that you need in order to execute a watch like that. And being a CEO does not necessarily make you either a good designer or a good watchmaker. We've seen how that goes. But I think I would have picked it, because the aesthetics really work. It's technically interesting. I mean, it is not lavishly hand finished throughout, a la a Patek.
And that's maybe where I would deduct points, because I feel like given that it is 150,000 francs, I would have loved to see them maybe go with just a steel case and put the money into movement finishing, because it is such a prestige piece. I'm not going to fault it technically. Technically, it's awesome. I would have swapped the platinum for a more artisanal movement, given the price and the positioning.
How much do you think real lavish top to bottom hand finishing would have added to the price?
Let's say,
because Grubel charges 600,000.
You got to remember that the OEM price to make a watch is always a lot lower than we all think. So what would it have cost to send the parts out to Philippe Norbel or Nathalie Jean-Louis, people who finish parts like Grubel standard basically for a living? Given how many of these they're going to make, sending those parts kits out and getting them finished by those people or specialists like them, I think, let's say we tack, I don't know, $20,000 cost onto the watch, but we also make it in titanium so you don't have to pay for precious metal. Now I feel like that's a trade I'd be willing to make, because I feel like both sides of the watch would be equally special. I think it's a great watch, and I'm not questioning the win. I'm just saying, like, if I were to do it, if I were the captain, we all sort of armchair quarterback everything here in America, that's probably what I would have changed. But I think it's a valid win. I think it's a great watch. I think we maybe take it for granted that IWC has long sold a mechanically programmed sequential perpetual calendar in a classically beautiful model with a 7-day power reserve for a really long time. So maybe this reminds us how special that line is. Yeah,
which is, it's not a bad thing to be reminded of. And I mean, the GPHG as a whole raises the same questions every year. I mean, I was on the jury for 3 years, which was an interesting experience because, you go in and there isn't actually, some sort of predetermined consensus among the jury members about which watch is going to win. I mean, there's sometimes very, very heated arguments. So, like, once you get to the point where the jury is trying to decide which watches deserve to win in each category and which watch deserves the Aiguille d'Or, it's a very, very engaged, very kind of like passionate process. It's how you get there that seems to arouse not criticism or controversy, but just questions about the whole process and whether or not some way could be found to get some of the obviously important brands that don't participate in GPHG.
That's the thing. It is participation by consensus, but once you get into the actual nominees, I thought the Eternal Calendar was a good winner. I really thought it was a very striking design, maybe the best design of the year, because of the quality of the dial, the crystal. I thought that, again, if that were the new perpetual, the new Portuguese 7-day perpetual, I would have been like, boom, sign me up. I like the fact that it is technically distinguished. I do like platinum, even though it's gratuitous. I think that's very cool. Other winners, I was hugely heartened to see the Otsuka Low-Tech win its category, the challenge. The number 6, I don't know what we could say this looks like, an ammeter, a pressure gauge. I couldn't tell you what this watch looks like. It looks like a bunch of utilitarian instruments and gauges we've seen before, and yet at the same time it looks like none of them. And for a watch that's accessibly priced, that's built by a microscopic Japanese specialist constructor that costs very little money, but sort of has a mystique around it 'cause it's mostly Japanese domestic market. I mean, it's a Miyota movement with
Yeah,
basically
sure.
a digital hand style indicator. It's like a Vacheron Mercator that, I don't know, was intercepted by Nikola Tesla in the year 1890. I'm just saying, like, it's a very unusual aesthetic.
No, but I mean, it's
a lovely watch.
It's a fascinating watch, and it's a really interesting watch too. I think it was a little bit easy to miss because, I don't know, the challenge category is maybe, something that people might, kind of skim over when
It's like winning the Oscar for best sound.
Yeah, something like that. And best sound is that's great if you're a sound person.
Yeah, I mean, almost the highlight of your career.
Yeah, absolutely.
But again,
but this particular watch, I mean, it's what my lit crit friends would have called a multivalent design, right? Like it refers, like it looks relatively straightforward at first, but I mean, look at the things that you referenced. I mean, like Nikola Tesla. There's a little bit of steampunk thing going on there. It looks like maybe
the Vacheron Mercator. I mean,
it looks like maybe like an electrical gauge from the engineering panel of Captain Nemo's Nautilus. I mean, there's so many things that it kind of like touches on without being, too on the nose about it.
And
I thought it was great.
I mentioned this because you talk about the kind of opaque process of choosing a winner at GPHG. The fact that this watch, from a brand that has almost no advertising, nothing really but client word of mouth, very little interest in operating outside of Japan, the fact that this won an incredibly competitive category where there were plausibly hundreds of Swiss watches that fit that description of that price point that were new for this year. I thought that was really an endorsement of the GPHG at its best, that watch won. And I think that, hopefully, Jiro Katayama will get more attention going forward and we'll have the opportunity to buy them internationally. But that was a win for the little guy.
Yeah, and it's interesting with the GPHG. Every year there are always reasons to wish it could be better, but there are always also, and this watch is a perfect example, there are also reasons to sort of applaud it for what it does in terms of making things visible and giving prominence to things that really are worthy of attention, but like might otherwise struggle to sort of be visible in the market.
Now, in terms of other stuff that I really liked to see, I loved that the Beauvais Recital 28 Prowess won mechanical exception, because I feel like Beauvais should take home an award every year. Okay, so this watch is a little bit much, but more is more.
Okay, well let's be. It's a bizarre ass watch.
It is. It's 46.3 millimeters.
However,
it's bizarre. It's got a flying tourbillon, perpetual calendar, a world timer with daylight savings time built in. It's got a 10-hour power reserve. It's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot, and it looks like a lot. I think that's where you're going.
Yeah, it looks like a lot, and the whole question of building a world time watch that can sort of organically handle the problem of daylight saving time and non-daylight saving time, it's an interesting one because one of the things that I personally love about astronomical complications, and you can look at the perpetual calendar, for instance, and the world timer as kind of astronomical complications because they exist because of variations or because of the structure of the Earth's orbit around the sun. It's the daylight saving time and standard time are like time zones, but even more so, absolutely, completely artifacts of modern governments and legal systems. Like the only reason that they exist is because they have been brought into existence by fiat, by a bill that was signed into law. And yet they remain factors that affect the conduct of everyday life. I remember going to Basel World. It used to happen in the middle of Basel World every year. The Central European time would go from standard time to daylight saving time. I think that's
you would spring forward.
You would spring forward, yeah. And for sure, the next morning, every single American journalist would be an hour late for their meetings. So it affects us, and having some way of organically coping with it is really, really hard to do. Most world time watches just kind of like, give up on the idea, but creating a mechanism with for each of the 24 time zones, there's a little roller with four different reference cities on it. And, depending on whether or not you're in standard time or daylight saving time, that city might appear on that roller or the one before it or the one behind it. It's just, it's fascinating that they came up with this.
It feels like something designed for the Russian market, but not the Russian market today. The Russian market when like Catherine the Great was the czaress. Yeah. It feels almost like a Fabergé egg that tells time. And I'm so happy that things like that exist
Yep,
because it's a maximalist approach to decoration, engineering, watchmaking, packaging, problem solving, and feature density. And that's what I love about Beauvais. So I was happy to see that. I think, honestly, the complication and mechanical exception prize should really just be folded into one. But too many categories is like endemic to every award show ever. So, you know, again, that's why I like the Louis Vuitton prize, because, you know, 5 finalists, 1 winner, 1 award. That's it.
That's it.
You're done. So yeah, there are too many categories at the GPHG, but it's fun. It's fun.